Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast channel for sustainable procurement. We hope you like what you hear. Please go to www.iso2400.org for more information, learning resources, tools, and much more.
Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast for sustainable procurement. I'm delighted to welcome Star Scott from the USA today as part one of two podcasts. Welcome, Star.
Hi, Sean. Thanks for having me today.
You're very welcome. So, Star, would you like to start off by just telling us a bit about your background and how did you become involved in sustainability?
Sure. Well, honestly, if I go way back, even as a child, I had a connection with the earth. And while the other children were playing on the beach, I was kind of that kid off picking up trash, much to my family's dismay. But professionally, how I came to sustainability, my background's in wildlife biology and ecology. And in the early 2000s, I was working as a research scientist in ecology. I was shortly out of school, and I was looking at the amount of waste we were generating in the research lab that I was working in. And it was a tremendous amount of single-use plastics that we were generating every week. And I thought, if this project is successful and we get the data that we're looking for, then this has all kind of been worth it. But if it isn't, then we've really actually contributed to this greater problem that we're trying to solve. So from there, that was kind of the inception for me of the need for Green Labs, which is research in sustainability and research. And that was kind of where that started for me. And then along the way, about a decade ago, I started pitching this program to the University of Georgia, where I work, and pitching a Green Labs program to say, how can we be sustainable in our science? And from there, we created the program about 8 years ago, and that's what I've been doing. So my door into sustainability was kind of a side door. It wasn't a direct route, but maybe it was always calling me forward.
So you're a scientist by background. How do science and sustainability interact? How does that work in your mind?
So, I think we know all of these positive contributions of science. We know the contributions to public and environmental health, to technology. We know how it helps our economy. But really, science has actually operated for a very long time as though we're exempt from our operational impact. And part of that is because of the good we are doing in the world. But the reality is that science does have an impact. And so, as scientists, we really need to mitigate that and minimize that. And there's a lot of ways we can do that, but we have to kind of redefine what it means to do good science. So, historically speaking, that has been about good science, has been about reproducibility and rigor and bringing in funding and these types of things. But the reality is that we also have to be doing our science sustainably. The scientific enterprise has a massive impact on the world. My Green Lab, which is a nonprofit looking to make science more sustainable, they did a carbon impact study last year that came out. And what they found was that in that carbon impact study, that science had a tremendous impact on the planet, but also our scope 3 emissions specifically were actually double that of scope 1 and 2. They were actually 5 times higher than scope 1 and 2 put together. And so that really kind of focuses us towards the scope 3 emissions, which, as you know, purchased goods and services are a huge part of that.
So you're differentiating the sort of good that actual science can do compared to doing the science, which is actually impactful in its own right. And certainly that mirrors my experience as well. We've done carbon footprints for a number of universities in the UK, and they're huge. There's a really big impact there. So I guess that takes us then to sustainable procurement. As you say, if you start to think about scope three, you're immediately starting to think about your supply chain. So how has that got you into sustainable procurement?
Yeah, like you said, it's very paradoxical that our impact is actually directly impacting those things we're trying to change. So, like I spoke a couple of weeks ago at the CDC Biosafety Symposium, and there were a lot of public health professionals in the room. And, I said, for those of you who are working on public health, do you know the impact of emissions on asthma? And everyone in the room said, "Yeah, we kind of know that impact." And the reality is, yeah, at that place, that is our operations directly contribute to those emissions. And then, like you said, certainly scope three leading us into that procurement piece. So, my background, like I mentioned, is in ecology. And one of the founding principles of ecology is this concept of interconnectedness. And it's really that you can't pull one string without that string pulling on everything else. And I think procurement, it's interesting to me as a scientist learning so much about procurement, it's interesting to me to see how they really are quite similar. And you know this better than I do, Sean, but the things that we purchase, the things that are created have this impact that goes spans far along that value chain. And so that's the ecology piece is kind of, I guess, what started that concept of thinking about interconnection. And then really started seeing kind of the importance of this upstream and downstream type of thinking and those impacts. We started looking at in lab operations and what can we look at this way. But then we said, well, wait a second. Every item that comes into our lab has a story of how it impacted a community somewhere. And every waste stream that's leaving our lab going downstream, it has a story of how it's impacting a community somewhere. So all of these things came together. And then of course we also have our sustainable development goals, which are, I'm sure your listeners know, but those 17 United Nations sustainable development goals, which have to come together like a multi-layered cake. So if you're trying to you basically have to have that consideration for the social and the environmental and that economical piece simultaneously in order to have that true sustainable action. So when we kind of came together with these concepts and we pulled them all together, we do look at that in lab piece for sustainability of science. We do look at our waste streams and where they're going, but really there's this huge avenue to look upstream to say, all right, well, a lot of these problems that we have downstream can actually be solved by looking upstream. We can engineer out a lot of these issues before they ever arrive on our campus just through our procurement. And so that's kind of how we started focusing on the procurement piece within the Green Labs program at UGA.
This is really interesting because I was actually, I mean, it's great because I get to interview loads of people from all over the world that have perspectives on this. And I was talking to a lady from Germany a couple of weeks ago, and she was saying much of what you're saying. She kind of came to the realization that, you know what, procurement's got a lot of power. If only we were to use it and think about how we procure in different ways, it's, being that gateway to the supply chain is a really powerful place to be.
I mean, totally. Like even if like every lab that you go in on campus, or not just our campus, but at any research institution, you are going to see a wall of styrofoam coolers. And the researchers aren't even the user of that product. The scientific distributors are the user of that product. And yet, our institutions are left to manage that product. What do we do with this waste stream? People don't want to throw it away because we know that it just fills up landfills, but we don't quite know what to do with it. But there have been these cases where we had US institutions that said, okay, well, we now are going to strike at a policy level, at a procurement level to say, we're no longer allowing these styrofoam, this EPS foam coolers on our campus. The scientific distributors didn't miss a beat, Sean. They said, "Oh, no problem. We actually have this cardboard cooler that's been sitting on our shelf for the last 8 years waiting for this moment." So they're not going to lose our business. So really, this is about, at the stroke of a pen, basically, all of a sudden these institutions no longer had to manage these really hard to recycle end products. They didn't have to pay for the recycling fees or the, landfill tipping fees. And that was just because of a policy. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting having worked downstream for so long to look upstream and see how the changes that can be made by looking upstream to procurement really give us a lot of hope.
It's amazing, isn't it? Sometimes you just have to ask the supplier, and in the example you've got, just asking for a different product, and they've already got it. It's but doesn't take a lot of effort, does it? You can get a really big win by just doing that. Okay, so Star, could you give us some more examples of things that you're working on at the moment?
Sure. So we wanted to look at our common lab consumables and see how we could potentially be purchasing more sustainably. And so one of the things we decided to look at were nitrile gloves. I know you've talked about this before too, but several years ago, we were seeing that the US Customs and Border Protection were issuing these withhold release orders to kind of stop the importation of nitrile gloves coming into the US. And at that time, all we could see and all we had visibility of was that these withhold release orders were being issued for debt bondage and human trafficking and forced labor in the nitrile glove supply chain. So they were coming in from Malaysia, which supplies over two-thirds of the United States nitrile gloves, and actually about two-thirds of the world's supply as well. Malaysia does. And so we wanted to look at nitrile gloves. This is a very common lab consumable. It's used throughout science, it's used throughout medicine. The US is the number one user of nitrile gloves in the world. And in science, we use them for sterility of our projects, of our studies. We know that they protect us, they're vital PPE. There's all these great reasons that we use them. But we started kind of looking at the life cycle of nitrile gloves, and we saw this labor piece in conjunction with what the US government was finding on these withhold release orders, that importation prohibition. And so we thought, okay, we need to really start looking at this. And at that time, we met, my program, the Green Labs program, met with UGA procurement, and we said, we want to create a safe list. So we want to create a list of nitrile gloves that when our researchers go on to our punch out system, that they can, if they are ordering a glove that is problematic or created using forced labor, a pop-up would come up that would say, would you prefer to order a comparable product that's been made using fair labor? And so this seemed like a great project. And as a scientist coming at a supply chain research, it seemed to me like, oh, this should be pretty easy. We'll identify some clear criteria with which to use, and then we'll just apply that. And that's when I kind of fell down a rabbit hole that lasted several years now and learning the things you don't know what you don't know. And so what we found from that was that these criteria we were looking for really didn't exist. So every criteria that we thought of was problematic in some way. So it had some limitation in some way. So for example, one of the criteria we thought of was, well, what if there is, a factory standard, social standard like the SA 8000 that's related. And a lot of these companies, glove companies, have these forward facing statements, code of conducts, or, their sustainability kind of supplier code of conduct, all these outward facing, public facing documents that say, oh, we're SA 8000 certified. And we thought, this is fantastic. But as we met with these companies, what we found out was that they may have 8 factories in 6 different countries, and maybe 2 or 3 of them had this certification, And that was likely, like it was around 9% of their total output. And there weren't part numbers where we could order exclusively from those factories. So we kind of kept whittling down these proposed criteria and kind of punching holes in what we were hoping was going to be secure footing for this project. And of course, you know this, but the idea of fair labor is a win-win for both the suppliers and the purchasers, because on the purchaser side, in higher ed, we have due diligence policies, we have no harm policies. We also don't want to be spending state funding on something that violates US trade law. So there's a lot of reasons why purchasing this. I mean, other than the very obvious social reasons of we don't want our good science to be driving suffering halfway around the world. That being, for me, the most forefront reason. But at that point, we realized this safe list is going to be a little harder than we thought. And we're going to need to see something different, something that would be more secure and that was objective. There's a lot of different social criteria out there. The auditing processes are very different for each of them. Some of them have an internal audit, some of them have both internal and external. The frequency of those external audits changes. So, this is really a rabbit hole for a scientist like me to fall down into, just trying to look at one lab consumable. And this is out of thousands of lab consumables that we have. So we are still in this project. We are still trying to figure out a path forward. I will say this, Sean, this is a little random, but someone said, well, what's the answer? And I said, okay, for nitrile gloves right now, the two largest glove providers for medicine and for science are being sued right now in US District Court for forced labor. It's a class action lawsuit. You can find it on the web, has the entire lawsuit there. And we've seen some nice fair labor certifications in three different sectors of the economy. We've seen the chocolate, coffee, and apparel. They all have these fair labor certifications, which are pretty strong. And all three of those came out of these scandals where companies were found to have forced labor, child labor, human rights violations. And out of that, they self funded through a third party a fair labor certification for their sector. And so that's my hope that this lawsuit that's happening right now in US District Court, maybe the outcome of that will be similar. And businesses will be doing that, I guess, as a PR move to kind of to save face. But it doesn't matter from a purchaser standpoint. We just want to be able to purchase products that aren't driving suffering halfway around the world. I'll also say we worked with Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, which is an organization here in the US, to create a laboratory guidance procurement document. And so that has this story and some other resources in it for the lab supplies. I think that was a really long answer to a very short question, but that's just one of the things we're trying to do to make UGA's laboratory and science procurement more sustainable.
No, it's a really good answer to a short question because I think it just illustrates how hard some of these things are to do. And certainly, my colleagues have been working with the National Health Service in the UK on a very similar challenge. Your nitrile gloves are coming from Malaysia. You can't really tell which factory they come from. You can't, if you start asking sort of developed world questions about their social value, they mean nothing in that part of the world. And even if you do get to criteria around, as you say, forced labor, bonded labor, whatever, how do you know? And it's not untypical in many parts of the world for manufacturing goods of this type, where, as you say, there'll be one or two lovely, certified, beautiful factories, and they're the ones that they show the auditor, but it's not where your stuff's being made. And when you're buying tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of the same products, it's very hard to have that traceability and to really understand it. So I don't think anybody's got the answer to nitrile gloves yet, and I'm quite tempted actually. I've spoken to a number of people through this series in health procurement, and I think it might be good to get you and some other people in the world together to talk about some of these issues, because the whole issue of kind of consumable products, as you say, for health and for science, are quite similar. And I think they're a really tough nut to crack. So credit to you for giving it a try, and hopefully we'll get a certification that works eventually.
That would be great. I mean, the reality too is that science is one sector that we really reap all the benefits of our actions and very, very little of the burden, right? So for every action in the world, we have that kind of benefit and burden aspect to it. But science in general and scientists and researchers, we kind of reap all the reward. We get all the benefit from science and we carry very little of the burden for that. And we're very privileged in that way. But we really have to expand that thinking, that concept of interconnectedness to say, well, wait a second. How is our science impacting this community in Malaysia? How is our science impacting, I mean, these are workers who come from Myanmar, Indonesia, Vietnam, and they go there with this promise of taking care of their families, of making enough money to send back home. They're paying up to 5,000 US dollars for the opportunity to work in one of these glove factories. And what they find are 12-hour days, 7 days a week, 1 day off a month. Their passports are taken. They're forced to live in a dorm on site. They're forced to buy overpriced food from the canteen that's on site. And this, in effect, traps them in that initial debt for years. It is a nightmare for these individuals. And, when I share this with our researchers, they immediately think, oh, well, we can probably engineer out some of our use. And, obviously we want them to use it when it's critical PPE. But when I worked in a lab, I would put on a clean pair of nitrile gloves to take, around to the autoclave. I didn't need to. I just did it for this extra sterility. And also because that's kind of where your mind goes to when you're running sterile technique and these types of processes. So some of that can be engineered out at the user level, but certainly, like you said, we do need to have a collective approach. Science and medicine, we share so much overlap. So I always kind of group those together. We need to be looking at this global impact and asking how can we mitigate that?
Yeah, I think it's another really good point that's worth highlighting. The most sustainable thing you ever buy is the thing that you don't buy at all, and demand management becomes really key. Now, you in a lab environment and in a medical environment, you're never going to stop using nitrile gloves, but certainly it's helpful to ask the question: Do we really need as many as we do? So that's fantastic. Staff, thanks very much for those insights and your perspective on some of the challenges in higher education and lab procurement. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you. We look forward to part 2, where we talk a little more about your achievements in this area.
Thank you for listening to our podcast on Sense and Sustainability. Please listen out for more episodes. For more information, learning resources, tools, and much more content on sustainable procurement, go to www.iso2400.org.